Hi, I'm Stanley Robinson, and I want to talk to you today on the topic of the necessity of post-capitalism that has come to us because of our need to deal with climate change. And first, I think it's important to say that we are on the verge of creating a mass extinction event, an anthropogenic mass extinction event that we have caused. And so climate is not the only issue involved here. We talk about climate a lot because it's something we can conceptualize, and it resembles turning a thermostat up or down. It feels like something we could actually do something about, but it actually is only one part of the problem, which is a more general environmental collapse, uh, of which climate change is one of the main symptoms. But as we know, climate change is also heavily involved with ocean acidification, and the acidification of the oceans is not something that we can change or ameliorate once we've done it. And it's very possible that we might crash the bottom of the food chain in the ocean, such that the rest of the food chain would also collapse. And so there are also habitat problems everywhere, forest problems. So when we talk about climate change, we need to remember that it's a metonymy or a synecdoche for a larger environmental problem, that it's maybe better to call the mass extinction event. So one way to characterize it, and it brings us back to climate, is that um, the scientists have estimated that we can burn about 500 more gigatons of carbon before we heat up the world past the 1.5 centigrade average global temperature rise that the scientists have identified as being as high as we can raise the Earth's temperature before we begin to trigger other secondary effects and perhaps cross tipping points into a much greater rise that radically changes the planet in a destructive way. So, okay, 500 more gigatons. At the rate that we're burning it now, that would give us till about 2030 or 2040. So there's quite a pressure of time here. And of course, if we reduce our burn of carbon, that gives us a little bit longer time before we hit that 500 gigaton limit. But it sits there as a hard and fast limit, teaching us that we need to move fast on this. At the same time, and of course now the price of oil is dropping rather than rising, but so it doesn't, prices don't respond to realities in this and in so many ways. But at the same time, it has to be said that we've already identified in the ground 2,500 gigatons of fossil fuels, of carbon, in the form of coal, oil, and natural gas. And those 2,500 gigatons of carbons are already on the books of the fossil fuel industries. They are listed as assets, they've been loaned against already, they've been leveraged out, and the fossil fuel companies intend to burn them all. And they're also listed amongst the nation states as um, assets of the nation as well, as parts of these nations' geopolitical power, so that Canada, Russia, Saudi Arabia, United States, Australia, these are all carbon-rich countries that consider the carbon that they're within their territorial limits as being part of their national strength, and their political leaders are also committed, by and large, to burning this carbon and monetizing it as part of their national strength. So we have the power elite of this world in the form of chief executive officers of some of the biggest corporations on earth, and the national leaders that have been elected by the people, who consider it their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and also their political responsibility to their citizens and voters to burn that carbon. And yet, only 500 of the 2,500 gigatons of carbon that have been identified can be burned before we've torched the planet. So that implies that 2,000 gigatons of carbon, which at the current costs of carbon, which is an entirely artificial thing, but if just to give yourself a sense of it, it would be something like $160 trillion or $1,600 trillion. It sort of depends on which figure you use. In any case, a vast amount of money, in theory, could be made from selling and burning that carbon. So there has to be a renunciation of of money in this case that is not something that the capitalist system is designed to do. It simply isn't. The capitalist system is a very simple algorithm, which starts out from the ideas of Adam Smith and then the economist Pareto, essentially that more is better. And that if all things being equal and everything else is really put to the side, more is better. And so the algorithm has a derivative, which is profit is good and shareholder value are good. These are the two rubrics of goodness in the global civilization that we live in. Things are rated by this system alone. Profit and shareholder value is a designation of good actions. And everything else is designed as a restraint on that basic algorithm. So in the case of carbon, it's the World Bank itself, which is quite interesting, that has said we need to put a price on carbon. And what they mean by that is that the natural balance of supply and demand, the free market price that we put on carbon is disastrously too low. So putting a price on carbon is saying that the free market system doesn't work and that in this case there is what they call a market failure. Well, for the World Bank, which is really one of the stalwart institutions of the global capitalist system, to say this is to say that the free market system doesn't work. It's not really news to a lot of us, and since 2008 it's been fairly obvious that this is true, but for the World Bank to be saying it and to be calling for a non-market system to be imposed on capitalism is an admission that the system doesn't work. But what I'd like to point out, because of this larger environmental catastrophe, is that carbon is not the only market failure, and it is not just the case that there are market failures. It is the case that the market is a failure in that it prices things wrong systemically. So what I mean by this is that in capitalist economics, they're very proud of what they call the cumulative equilibrium, which is the balance of supply and demand coming to a price that is agreed upon in a crowdsourced and democratic manner. Buyers and sellers get together and agree on the price of things, and then the buyers pay the money, the sellers take the money, the deal is done. And when you aggregate all of these transactions together, you get what is called the cumulative equilibrium, which is always volatile. So calling it equilibrium is a little bit funny, but really they just mean supply, demand, and a price. Now, the problem is that in a purely free situation of just making contracts on a deal, the sellers need to sell their product for as low as possible because the buyers are always going to buy things at the lowest price they can get it at because they themselves are impoverished by this very same system, which I'll talk about later. So the buyers will always buy at the lowest price for any given thing. Sellers are therefore in competition with each other. They price it as low as they can and yet still make a profit. But the problem is that they systemically end up selling things for less than it costs to make them if you include labor costs and environmental costs in the costs of making it. And so what they do is they throw those costs off the books. They ignore them or disappear them in one way or another. So the results are this. In terms of labor costs, people are underpaid and are impoverished and are in the precariat. Everybody's situation is precarious. And nobody can count on healthcare, job security, pension, and so on. And then in the environment, they call it externalities, but the costs of the raw materials are not being paid in full. And in both cases, these costs are being shoved onto future generations. So they're discounted in a way that is mathematically clear, but the heavy discounting is always paying less attention to the future, assuming that the future will be richer than us and will be able to pay for the problems that we've made, and also assuming that all problems are fungible in that everything can be paid its way out of. So that the imagination in straight line economics is that if we were to hand on to 3 generations down the line a devastated Earth, they would just pay the necessary money to recreate the Earth in a proper way. But unfortunately, everything is not fungible, and you can't pay your way out of ocean acidification and a mass extinction event. It doesn't matter how rich they are in economic terms or in the amount of money they have in the bank, it's not something that can be paid out of. So It also is a system that doesn't have any restraints in terms of where the money goes. Capital accumulation is like gravity, it creates black holes of money. 1% of the world's population owns about 42% of the human wealth, and about 5% of the human population owns 80 to 85% of the human wealth. And so this is just not people gaming the system. This is the system operating in its normal way. So you have inequality. You have a very small part of the population that's enormously wealthy, and their impacts on the environment come through hyperconsumption. Then you have 2 to 3 billion people who are immiserated, and so a very big percentage of the human population is immiserated, living in misery, in other words. And they also have a bad impact on the environment through deforestation and topsoil loss, because in order to cook their food that night to feed their families, they cut down the forests, and then in order to feed their families in the season, the soil is depleted rapidly, and they cannot afford to pay attention to the long term because they're in desperate straits day to day. So in other words, the richest and poorest parts of the human community are the biggest impacts on the environment, and everybody ends up endangered by the destruction of our biosphere. So, given that this is the case, and I think now there's very little argument that this is not the case. I don't think anybody anymore can, with a straight face, argue that the free market system will solve all these ills, that prices will go up appropriately. It hasn't happened with the most dangerous substance that we have, which is carbon. The examples that are occasionally given are very, very weak, and the idea that we could regulate the ordinary workings of capitalism in a way that would work they've never been proved, and they're highly questionable. So this is why we get the phrase of my teacher Frederick Jameson, and Zizek has also picked up on this phrase, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, because it's a worldwide order in which all of the laws are integrated, and there's very few small pockets of resistance to this global capitalist order that we live in that is in fact wrecking the biosphere and human lives. So in essence, what I'm saying is that if we were to recover from the environmental catastrophe and avoid it, we would have to also reform capitalism so radically that it would end up being called post-capitalism. And this is an interesting concept because we don't have any models for post-capitalism. Economics is surprisingly descriptive rather than prescriptive. It never goes into a speculative realm of saying what should be or how could we run things so that it was so that we were actually in balance with our biosphere, and that there was also justice amongst humans and adequacy for all. There are very few, essentially this is no longer economics, this is political economy. And although we have many economics departments and many economists, we don't have many political economy departments anymore. It's almost a 19th century term. And we don't have people who would say that I do politics or I do political economy that is heavily invested in trying to imagine new economic systems that would solve these problems that we're careening into so quickly. So this is why people talk about it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. It doesn't look like we can afford the future. It doesn't look like we can pay for saving the earth. And in this this ideological fixation of ours that only the free market should rule, we are hurtling off a cliff into a disaster, not just for our species, but for the entire biosphere. And many of the mammals are endangered. The mass extinction event will mean truly extinctions for many creatures that have been here for millions of years. So I'm going to say that this phrase, easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, is partly, if you look at the form of that phrase, end of the world is bad. And maybe what we're saying here is that end of the capitalism is good. So what the phrase is saying is it's easier to imagine bad things than it is to imagine good things. It's easier, from my terms as a science fiction writer, to do dystopia than it is to do utopia. And it certainly seems true in terms of drama and setting up narrative tension and danger for characters to imagine a bad place and do a dystopia. and imagine the world ending than it is to imagine a utopian future in which things go right in such a complicated world with the trajectories that are already in place. But we are very imaginative, and it's by no means impossible to imagine the end of capitalism. You just have to run it through in a stepwise fashion that first, there's a couple ways to go about it, but you could try to imagine, well, if things were going right, what would it be like? And then you have the second step of, if that's a desirable end state, how do we get from here to there? So it's not just imagining a utopian system, which is really kind of an experiment or a thought experiment, an exercise, but also trying to imagine a plausible history that gets us from here to there. And I'm very interested in both of these. So it's a question now in people looking at the situation with, in late capitalism, it looks like finance rules, essentially capital rules. And so then what is the state? What is the nation state? Is the state merely been bought by capital and therefore is essentially effectively the police and the enforcers of the capitalist system, which is highly oligarchic and not democratic? Or is the state really an expression of people at large and therefore what it says it is, which is to say democratic systems? And here you have to come to the realization that democracy and capitalism are not allied at all in the moment that we're in right now. And in fact, there's been a concerted effort by capital to buy the governments of the world so that whatever people vote for, it's not actually what the governments do, which is always to support finance over people, always to support debt, and public debt means people debt. And if you imagine that government is of the people, by the people, for the people, you also have to imagine that that situation is aspirational, that it's under attack, that it can be lost, that it has to always be fought for. And it doesn't exist right now in an obvious way because we keep electing politicians that then go and do what the banks tell them to do, and the banks are actually funding their campaigns. So whether they're responding to their voters or to their campaign contributors, the results seem clear. They're responding to their campaign contributors and to money itself. So, and then you get to a notion of the state as a battleground, as the site of contestation. It's not a done deal. It isn't clear what the state is. And the various definitions of it that are often made by anti-statists of one sort or another, libertarians, anarchists, leftists of all varieties who are somehow convinced that the state is so allied with capital that really the two are synonymous. You have to detach yourself from that point of view and think, no, actually the state is always open for contestation. And it's a little bit of a bad irony to think that seizing the state by votes alone, by changing the laws, would be almost the equivalent of a coup at this point, but it might also be a legal coup in that you just by following the laws of the land, by making political parties do what is good for the people and for the planet rather than good for finance. This is a little bit of a revolution, but it's also perfectly legal, and it's what the cover story, what the front of democratic government says it's all about anyway. So what would be interesting is to take that seriously and to force the parties and the governments to do what's good for people and for the planet by way of mass action, by way of not only votes, but also effectively a kind of a civil resistance of the people against finance. So in that struggle, one often hears a certain pessimism or cynicism that we've lost before we've begun because the fight's been going a long time and there have not been victories, especially since 1980 and the Reagan-Thatcher counter-revolution that has started the neoliberal turn, and we've decisively lost in these last 36 years. True in some senses, but the battle's never quite over. And if government has become a kind of false front or a kabuki, it would be interesting to have the kabuki players suddenly, in effect, be using real knives and take over the play and change the script by forcing a government to do of the people, by the people, for the people, and act in defense of the future generations and the people and the environment. Adequacy for all, survivability for the other mammals on the planet, etc. So how might this work in terms of the stepwise fashion? This is where I'm thinking that finance is, with this one simple algorithm that more is better, and that profit and shareholder value are the only rubrics of success. They have, in an antique system, you could call this greed, and I mean not personal greed of individuals, but a system that is greedy as such by having defined itself so simply, without any feedback loops to control what it's up to. This system is fragile. They call it efficient, like just-in-time manufacturing, but efficiency itself is anti-human and fragile. And economic efficiency is just a measure of how quickly money moves from everybody to the rich. And so it's not actually a physical value of any use whatsoever. What you would really want in a system, an engineered system, would be robustness or resilience. And so efficiency is not robust, it's not resilient. When you've got just-in-time manufacturing, if there's one break in that chain of events, then the whole system breaks down, and that's not resilient. What you would want to build into a system is resiliency. Modern finance capital doesn't have it. It's efficient but weak, but fragile and brittle because of that very efficiency of maximizing profit and shareholder value has left it leveraged out over an abyss. And I mean leveraged in the economic sense. All of the big banks, the big private banks and the big investment firms have taken their assets, borrowed off of them, loaned off of them again, and this is called leveraging, and they have managed to leverage themselves out to 20 to 50 times how much they actually have in hand, in assets in hand. And after the 2008 crash, Congress tried to impose some reforms on the American banks, and the American banks were so resistant to this that I believe that the new rules state that they have to have somewhere between 3 to 5% of their loan amounts in assets in hand, which means that if there was ever any kind of run or crash or a break in the chain of efficiencies in terms of money coming into them, they would immediately fall apart like they did in 2008. And so one of their sources of their income are people's payments, their debts, and especially mortgages, utility payments, pension payments, student debt, and rent in general. So they take in this steady stream of money from millions of people, which is contractually due to them. They rely on it coming in. They assume it's going to come in as contractually obliged on a regular basis, but then they bundle it, repackage it, sell it again, loan it out, and leverage it so that the flow of money coming in is absolutely necessary to them, but it's also just a springboard for them to creation of even more financial value. What it means is, what happened in 2008 was there was a subprime mortgage crisis. A lot of people had promised to pay money that didn't have the money to pay it. When the time came for them to pay it and they couldn't, there was an accidental mass action, like a strike or a default, where enough people defaulted on these subprime mortgages that the system that relied on them being good, when they turned out to be bad, the system crashed and finance had to go to the government and say, bail us out. And indeed, in 2008, the government bailed them out at 100 cents on the dollar. The banks were saved, the individual depositors and the people who had failed in their mortgages were not saved. So what's interesting about this, and nothing changed afterwards in terms of the laws. There was Dodd-Frank, there was Oxley-Sarbanes. These are not trivial or inconsiderable, but they weren't enough to solve the problem, and we are back where we started. So that this is the way capitalism works when it has such a simple algorithm. The bubble bubbles up, and at some point there's a collapse, things are wrecked for a while, there's a recession or depression, and then it rebuilds. And the capitalist apologists will say, well, that's just creative destruction. But in fact, it's actually very destructive destruction. What's interesting, however, is it's inevitable it's going to happen again, and it could be done on purpose as a kind of a strike against finance, a people's strike against finance. All you would need is an agreement and a plan and a government ready to take the right action as a result. So that a certain point comes along, July 4th, 20x sometime. Everybody knows that it's going to happen. Everybody has the plan. Maybe everybody's part of a householders union so that you have some legal coverage. Maybe it's nothing but legal actions that have been planned, like everybody going down to the bank and withdrawing on the same day, withdrawing their deposits. That's an impossible thing for the banks to agree with, because they don't have the assets in hand to give everybody, every one of their depositors, their full deposits. They don't have it. They've lent it out elsewhere. It's possible that citizens can therefore crash finance and cause them to go into a tailspin and go into bankruptcy where they can't pay each other for the massive indebtedness of their interlocked system. And at that point, they will go to the government again and say, we need a bailout. Something's happened here. And then we have to have a government in place. Chair of the Federal Reserve is very important, president's very important, but in any case, when the story's out there, if it was part of a plan, then what the government would have to say to finance at that point is, yes, we'll bail you out. We need finance. If finance crashes, the world economy crashes, everybody hurts really badly. We save you, but we also, now we own you. This would be like General Motors in 2008, where we nationalized General Motors for a while and made them pay us back for what we were loaned before they got back on their feet. You do that to the banks, and the banks failed so much more disastrously than General Motors. It's estimated, for instance, that it was about $7.7 trillion that we gave to the banks to keep them solvent after the 2008 crisis. And this is a sum of money that is bigger than, the Louisiana Purchase, the Marshall Plan, the Vietnam War, the Iraq Wars, the savings and loan crisis of the 80s. All of those put together are less than what we paid the banks after 2008. So, in this strike, or this declaration of odious debt, this strategic defaulting, this mass action, this declaration of a jubilee, at that point we need the government to say, yes, but we save you, but we're nationalizing the banks. The banks are now federal credit unions. They do what banks do. They still make loans. They still make even a profit, but that profit belongs to the US Treasury and the American people. And bankers can still make a decent salary. They don't need the grotesque bonuses. It only gives them poor health. But if they know that they're still making a very good living, then and that their work is suddenly patriotic and in the service of the American people, it will be an adjustment. I'm not saying that capital won't fight this tooth and claw out of some instinctive notion that more is always better, no matter what. People are very, as adults, are a little bit inflexible in their ideological positions. They believe this religion of capitalism. It is their religion, and so it's a little bit of a hard thing to make this adjustment. But if they're going to be personally all right, if their family and children are going to be personally all right, they will, in any case, have to do what the law tells them to. So at that point, you have government in control of finance. You have the state controlling finance rather than finance controlling the state. It would be a major judo move. It would be highly controversial. It would be a historical moment of the first order. But it's not magical. It's really a set of financial actions that people could do. And whilst that happened with nationalized banks, it might be the great moment to institute a Piketty tax, I call it, from Thomas Piketty, who wrote Capitalism in the 21st Century, a bestseller of a few years ago. His suggestion, his main argument in this book was that the rich go richer and the poor grow poorer, except in exceptional circumstances like World War II and immediately afterwards. Well, this is sort of what I call sky is blue science, where if enormous effort and statistical rigor, someone proves that the sky is blue. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. This is like one of the first phrases in Bartlett's quotations. It's one of the oldest phrases on earth. So Piketty proving it statistically is only of limited value, but it is nice to have it in cold, hard, quantitative and pseudo-mathematical detail by an economist saying this. It's obvious, but it needs to be said as many times as possible. So what Piketty said we could do about it is to institute progressive taxation, which again is an old idea and not that revolutionary, but he said it should not just be on personal incomes, this progressive taxation, but it should be on capital assets also, both personal and corporate, and be progressive there too. So in other words, the bigger a company was, the more it's paying out of its asset base. So that if a company of $1 billion was forced to pay 20% of its asset every year, then this would quickly downsize it, and it would quickly break itself up to reduce its prominence in the progressive tax structure. And also, it would mean, again, that government is no longer indebted to finance, but in fact, government has an enormous amount of surplus at that point, because it's saying the people made this, and we, working of the people, by the people, and for the people, are saying that this is something that we have to do. So then at that point, well, there was all kinds of ancillary problems, of secondary repercussions of something like this, of enormous turmoil, et cetera, et cetera. But what you could then say is that the state could then afford healthcare for everybody, single payer. The state could afford free education for everybody right through college. The state could afford a full employment, in other words, employing anybody that didn't have a job otherwise. And that would be a paradigm buster in its own right, because if the government offered a job to everybody, then suddenly private industry would have to have competition for labor and would have to pay it commensurate to the supply and demand dynamic, such that wages would rise if there was full employment, especially if the government set a minimum wage that was a living wage. So at that point, you have a living wage for everybody, you have adequacy, education, and essentially you get the kind of supposed utopian goal of food, water, shelter, clothing, education, and healthcare, and work for everybody equally. This is the goal, and that goal, combined with a kind of earth ethic of seeing that we're part of a biosphere, that if people have adequacy, they will stop destroying the environment at the same rate, because, as I said before, that comes from the poorest and the richest parts of a population. If there was a horizontalization to everybody at adequacy, but nobody spectacularly rich, nobody spectacularly or painfully poor, you've got a situation where getting into balance with the biosphere would be the main project, and all of this extra employment that the government employing people would do could often be landscape restoration or the manning of sailboats rather than diesel boats, because we would still need trade, we would still need travel. What's interesting is you combine these social and economic changes with technical improvements that make a cleaner tech, what you get is a kind of a net balance, a permaculture, where the human civilization is actually in a sustainable, renewable balance with the biosphere itself, and the biosphere's ability to give us what we need in terms of food and shelter, but also gets to renew itself and also process our wastes and our poisons, which is really quite a processing difficulty, because we're making so many chemicals that have never existed before. All of this, the physical flows involved work, and so the main problem, and the technologies are being developed and have already been developed. So you don't need new tech here, except for this one technology that we call economics, that we call politics. These two are technologies. They're software. None of our computers would run without software. Our technology is not just inert matter. Our technologies are systems. So you have to think of language as a technology. You have to think of justice as a technology, the rule of law. These are also technologies. They're softwares that we use necessarily to keep going, because 7 billion people on this planet is already an artificial achievement that is a dangerously over-leveraging the biosphere's ability to support us. It can be done, but it has to be done right with really smart tech. And the main one is our systems, our social systems that we use to decide and run everything else. So, this that I've just told you is a kind of a utopian science fiction story, but I want to also point out that there are practical steps that are political positions that are already out there on the table. Some of them are laws already in the social democracies. Some of them are bills that are in the governments of the world. So the sequence would go first anti-austerity, because austerity is just the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Make people suffer, make capital have more capital, see if that solves the problem. It's actually the crazy response of doing the same thing that got us in trouble in the first place and seeing if it might work by way of repression. Or even a cynical notion that since things won't work, I need as much as I can before the whole thing falls apart. Anti-austerity, and that means Keynesianism. And Keynes was a very good economist, and he talked about government and business being in imbalance. Public and private is a very amorphous dichotomy because everything that the public does has to go through private citizens and private organizations. So this bashing of government of the last 36 years has been disastrous for people and for the planet. So you need a return of government to the control of the system, and you need government control of finance itself, people over capital. So Keynesianism is one step. Then you kind of get to social democracies, which we already have in Scandinavia and elsewhere. In Cuba should never be forgotten. Social democracies are a place where you're saying there are more values than just profit and shareholder value. There are overriding concerns, social concerns. So that's social democracy. After that, maybe you get to a space that I would like to just call post-capitalism, because I don't want to weight it down with the baggage of any earlier systems that have ever been proposed or devised. If you talk about socialism, I mean, more power to Bernie Sanders, but really what it comes down to is bringing in baggage from the 20th century that might not be how things work in the high-tech 21st century that we're in. So let's just call it post-capitalism. After social democracy, there will be further improvements towards, I sometimes call it permaculture, because it's both permanent culture and it's permutating culture. Permaculture is a good word. Sustainability is a good word, although you don't want to combine it to sustainable development, because development is a capitalist word. So what you want is sustainable civilization. What you want is a balance of adequacy over the long haul. And it isn't clear that the phrase sustainable development is one of these captured phrases that you shouldn't use. So whatever we get to, the steps to be taken along the way are simply political steps that can be done legally by votes, by politicians passing bills, by people supporting those politicians and not the other ones, and by seeing the situation clearly enough to believe that this is the way forward. These are the crucial steps along the way, and if there needs to be a mass action like the civil disobedience that I described, the strategic default, the deliberate crashing of the banks and taking of them over, nationalizing the banks is, I think, the key phrase in the story that I've just told you in terms of actually doing something that would have an effect. Beyond that, it would unleash a whole host of new problems. There's no doubt of that. This is not a solution. This is not an end game utopia that if we just did those things, everything would be all right. That's never going to happen. It's going to be dynamic and problematic for centuries to come, and maybe always. So you have to get over the idea that we can ever propose solutions that will hold. But just as steps going forward, these are the ones that I think that we have to contemplate and tell the story to each other. This move of nationalizing the banks can never come as a surprise. It shouldn't be like the secret coups where a junta suddenly jumps out of the woodwork and takes over the government and where surprise is necessary for it to work. That's not what this is. This needs to be a widely shared story that everybody agrees is the right way to go, and that's the only thing that would lead to its success. So I offer this story as one utopian science fiction story, and hope that it's stimulative to discussion and action going forward. Thank you.